This tutorial will cover procedural content generation, or PCG, which, as the name would suggest, is the process of procedurally generating content, or making content for a game in a way that relies on code to generate it. I will be using Unity 2019.1 for this demo. It will work the exact same in Unity 2019.2. In later versions of Unity, like 2019.3 and 2020, there have been some pretty major changes to the way the UI looks in Unity. So if you are using a later version of Unity, things might look a little bit different for you, but fundamentally it should work about the same. I have a little demo scene set up here that just has a plane for the ground and a patch of stretched out cylinders, which represents a clump of grass. And what I'm going to start by doing is I'm going to make a script that scatters the grass across the ground so that it has sort of a random feel to it and is not relying on me to manually place all of them. Now, if I wanted to spend my time just manually placing this grass, I would just use Control D to duplicate, and I would spread the grass around, and this would take me a while. It's not so bad with this amount of space, but if I had a very large level, this would not be a reasonable use of my time. Also, you get into some bad habits of just like dragging things in a straight line, and that kind of straight line would be noticeable to the player, that there's not the right kind of variety there that you expect to see when you look at grass. If you go outside and look at the grass in your yard or in your neighborhood, you probably can't pick out any areas of straight lines of the individual clumps of grass. Now, you might see straight lines where the grass meets the sidewalk or the road, but you would not see the clumps of grass themselves lining up in a straight line unless they were hand planted by someone. So let's get rid of all of those, and instead of hand placing all of my grass, I'm going to write a script that will place the grass for me. So I'm going to create a new C# script, and I'm going to name this grass generator, because the only thing it's going to do is generate the grass for me. Script names cannot have a space in them, so this is grass generator, all one word with no space. I did capitalize both G's just to make it a little bit more readable. And if we double click on this, it'll open up in Visual Studio. And what I want to do is I want to use the start function. I'm going to use the start function for this because I want it to happen right when the scene first loads. And what I want to do in the start function is I want to randomly place the grass around the scene in a designated area. So I only want it to fill in the area that I have this ground plane. The easiest way to do that is to figure out the dimensions of the space that I want to fill. So I'm going to just drag my grass blades around and figure out what are kind of the upper bounds of where I want the grass to end up. So if I drag it to the edges, I might see over here, I'm looking at the X value here, I'm seeing about at a 9, maybe a little more, maybe 9.5, but I'm going to cut it off at 9 so that it doesn't get too far and run over the edge. So I'm going to have 9 be my upper bound for X. And if I go over to the other side, since I scaled this uniformly, the plane at the very beginning, I scaled it uniformly, so I'm going to probably end up with -9 on the other side, and probably my Z value, my upper bound is also going to be 9 and -9. Now, I don't have to have it lined up with this plane. If I just had a specific patch I wanted to fill, I would just have to figure out the dimensions of that patch. So back in my script, I'm going to make some variables at the top of my script that I'm going to make them public so I can access them in the scene. This kind of generating content for a level is good to make a lot of the information public, because chances are there's a level designer involved in the project who wants to have some control over where and how the environment is being placed. So I'm going to make a public game object called grass, and this is where I will keep a reference to the grass object that I'm using to base all of this spawning on. So I'm going to have a public reference to the grass, and then I will use that to spawn copies of the grass. The next public variable that I'm going to want is the number of grasses that I want to spread around the scene. So this is going to be an int, which is a whole number. So I'll have a whole number of grass clumps that I place around the scene. And I'm going to call this total grasses. This will be the total number of grass clumps that I place around the scene. I'm also going to make public variables for the bounds that I just measured a moment ago. So 9 and -9 for x and 9 and -9 for z. So I'm going to make a public, and I actually could make this a float because I might actually want to use 9.5. So I'm going to do public float min x and a public float max x, and then the same for z, public float min z and public float max z. So now all of these variables are going to appear in my inspector when I place this script in the scene. I have not yet actually placed the script in the scene, so let me make an empty game object. And this game object, I'm going to call it grass spawner so I can find it easily. And I'm going to drag the script onto the game object. Now I'm going to take this grass clump that I have in my scene, and I'm going to drag that into the grass game object slot that I created. And I'm going to play around a bit with different total grasses for how much grass I want to place in the scene. I'm going to start with 30, and we'll see how that goes. And as the level designer, I would want to play with that number until I get something that feels good. So take some experimentation. For the min x, I decided I wanted -9.5, and max x was going to be 9.5. And just so you can see the differences of how these values are being used, I'm going to pick a different min z. So I'm going to do -5 for my min z, and my max z I'm going to do 9.5. So I'm actually going to be cutting off some of the z value, so you'll see an empty patch. This is just to demonstrate how it's working, and I'll end up setting that to -9.5 when I'm done. So I'm going to save the changes to the scene here, and then I'm going to go back to my script. Now in my start function, what I want to do is I want to use this information that was provided by the designer. Now I've set the values for the x and the z, but I do also want to just see what my y value should be. And so I'm going to look at the y value of the grass. So the y value of my grass is 0.38. And I'm just curious, I'm going to see what it looks like if it's at 0. So that's too low into the ground. So I'm going to want to make sure that I specify this -8.3 for my for my y value of my grass blades. And so I might also want that to be a public variable for the level designer. So we'll do public float min y. And I might actually want a little bit of variation between the y values of different grass clumps. So I could also do public float max y. But my min y and my max y are going to be very close to each other in value so that I don't have a lot of variation in the y's. So I am going to go back to my scene and select the grass spawner. And I'm going to set my min y to, I think, 0.38 was what my grass was at. Yeah, so 0.38. So I'm going to do 0.36 up to 0.4. Let's see what that difference looks like, just so I can. Maybe I'll go all the way down to 0.26 and up to 0.45. So my min y will be 0.26 and my max y will be 0.45. Save the changes to the scene and then back to the script. So now I can finally get into my start function. So what I want to do in my start function is I'm going to run a for loop. So I'm going to do for int I equals 0. So I is my enumerator my iterator that I will iterate through on each loop. And so I want this value to go all the way up to the total number of grasses that I'm going to place. So I is less than total grasses I plus plus. What this for loop does is it iterates through from 0 all the way up to total grasses, and it goes up by 1 each time. I'm having a little bit of issues with my formatting, so I am just going to tab these over so it looks better. Hopefully Visual Studio formats yours correctly, so I'm just tabbing so it looks nicer. So in this for loop, for I equals 0 all the way up to I equals total grasses, going up by 1 each time. And so what I want to do for each of those is I want to instantiate. Instantiate creates an object in the scene, and it requires a reference to an object. I already have a public reference to my grass, so I'm going to do grass as the thing that I'm instantiating. And then I want to do a a position and a rotation for this thing that I'm instantiating. So I'm instantiating the grass, and I want to tell it what position and what rotation. Before I tell it the position and the rotation, I need to actually calculate what I want those values to be. So before the instantiate line, I'm going to create a vector 3, which I'll use for my position. I'm going to call this temp pose for temporary position equals new vector 3, and here I need a value for x for the vector 3, and I'm going to do random dot range min x up to max x. So this value is going to be a random number between the minimum x and the maximum x. And then I'm going to do another random dot range for my min y up to max y. And the same thing for z. Random dot range min z up to max z. So now I have this temporary position, so I can use that as my position for the grass that I'm spawning. And then for the rotation, I'm just going to use the rotation of the spawner object. So I'll just use transform.rotation. So I'm not randomizing the rotation right now. It would probably be a good idea to randomize the rotation, but for now I'm just going to randomize the position. And let's save that script. And now we're ready to test it out. So let's go ahead and hit play. So now you can see I have a sort of a smattering of grass clumps around the scene. And this has some real visible randomness. So even though I did not specify anything about this middle section here, I am not seeing any grass clumps spawning in this area, but there's a lot of grass clumps over here. So this is how randomness works. You don't really have any control over how these things are spawning. Now you will notice that I don't have any spawning up here. That's because my max z or my min z value started at -5. And so I was doing that to demonstrate how it will not fill the entire area. And so if I were to change this to -9.5 and test it again, now it will fill the entire space. And if I wanted the grass to be more dense, I would change my total grasses. Let's bump it up to 90 and see how that looks. So now I have a lot of grass. So that's pretty good for spawning some random stuff in the environment. If you wanted to have multiple different types of things that you were spawning with this, you could have multiple game objects here. So for example, I'm going to make a sphere that would just sort of represent a rock maybe. And I'm going to duplicate a couple of times so it has sort of some variation to it. And I probably want this to be gray because rocks are normally gray. Turn down the smoothness so it's not shiny and give it a gray color. And then I would make an empty game object to hold all of this. So I would call this rock and put all 3 spheres underneath. And now I can go back to my script and I can say not just spawning grass, but also spawning rocks. And then in my for loop, each time I'm going to spawn something here. Actually, I probably would want a separate for loop for spawning my rocks. So I'm just going to copy this for loop and paste it. And instead of total grasses, I'm going to add another variable up here that's total rocks because there's a good chance I want a different number of rocks than I have of grasses. So this will be total rocks. And so my second for loop, instead of total grasses, this is going to be total rocks. And instead of spawning grass here, I'm going to spawn rock. And I'm going to keep the same random range information here because I want them to spawn in the same area. If I had a separate area that I wanted to spawn the rocks, then I would want to set up different min and max values for the rocks specifically. So now back to my scene, and I want my grass spawner, which is now not very accurately named because this is spawning grass and rocks. So here I would want to drag the rock into the second slot. And I need a total number for the rocks. So let's do 20. I probably don't want near as many rocks as I have of grass. And so now I have a pretty random assortment of rocks and grass. I feel like it's a little too heavy on the rocks right now, so I'm going to probably turn that down to maybe 14 rocks. And so every time I hit play, this will give me a random assortment of these environmental objects. Now, if you're making a game that involves the user going out and collecting these things, say, for example, if you're making a crafting game, then what you probably want is you want these objects to be collectible in some way. So you'd want the player to be able to collide with them and collect them if they're walking around with a character controller, or if they have, say, for example, a pickaxe that you're using to mine the objects, then you'd want to have them tagged in such a way that they would react to the player's pickaxe. But all of that would happen as a result of the character functionality, being able to interact with these objects. So the main thing you'd want to do is you'd want to tag your collectible type objects and have a collider and possibly a rigid body on them so they can detect when you are colliding with them to collect them. But this functionality gets you to a point where you have a random assortment of things placed around your scene. I hope you found this tutorial helpful and that you can use this to create a little bit more randomness with the environments that you're creating. And I hope to see you in the next tutorial. Thanks for watching.